All right. Well, thank you everyone for joining us. It is a pleasure for us to all be together. I want to say first, thank you very much to the organizers for creating this space to have us all come together to discuss our projects and the various ways in which they interact and overlap and can allow us to all become better peace builders through discussing our findings and our shared interests. Today, I'm very happy to be facilitating a discussion between Catholic Relief Services, a project looking at COVID-19 and its impact on social cohesion in 3 countries, in the Philippines, Ghana, and Guatemala. And also very happy to have our colleagues from Global Partnership for the Prevention of Armed Conflict, GPAC, who are joining from all around the world to speak about their work. Just a bit of housekeeping. The way that we're going to do this session is that we are going to start with a very brief introduction to our panelists and speakers. I'll be doing that, and I will introduce myself and the general objective of our conversation today. And then we are going to have a discussion where we bring our 2 projects into dialogue with one another to see what we can generate through that exchange. And then finally, we're going to open to questions, and we are really looking forward to having a interesting conversation with the participants in the room. I'm seeing that there are already quite a few names of people doing interesting work, so I'm excited to see what your questions will be and how we can bring those into our discussion. So first and foremost, I'll start by just saying I am Lynn McKay. It's my full name, Lynn McKay Derville. I'm realizing that's what it says on here. I am currently in Bangkok, Thailand, which is why it may look a little bit dark outside. So please do forgive me if I seem a little bit sleepy. I'll do my best to stay bright-eyed and bushy-tailed. I am a research anthropologist, and I have been working with CRS on their project looking at COVID-19 and social cohesion. My colleague, Sarah, is also here. She is going to be running the technical side of things. A quick mea culpa in that I think this is the first time we're all using this platform. So if you notice that there are any strange technical goings on, please bear with us. We will get it sorted eventually. But a big thank you to Sarah for helping to organize that on behind the scenes so that we can focus on our discussion. We have a number of interesting speakers today. I'm going to do just a very quick introduction so that we can then get immediately into the presentations. We have David Paidi, who is joining us from Ghana. David is a youth development specialist with a focus on peace building, youth livelihoods, and migration. He is currently leading CRS's Ghana youth portfolio, which encompasses peace building, gender and migration, and youth livelihoods interventions targeting young men and young women in Ghana and the sub-Sahara region, and in his region. David has had over 15 years experience designing and leading youth interventions and has extensive knowledge in community mobilization, community-based research, partnerships, humanitarian response, conflict, and peace work, amongst others. David was our key interlocutor for the research project that we were running in Ghana, so we're very much looking forward to having him here today. We also have with us Lucy Nusibe, who lives and works in East Jerusalem. She's the founder and executive chair of the Middle East Nonviolence and Democracy in East Jerusalem, pioneering promotion of awareness about the power of active nonviolence, especially work with schools and via innovative and educational uses of media, such as participatory video. She's the chair of the Improving Practice Working Group at GPAC and a member of the Gender Core Group. She is the chair of the Geneva-based Nonviolent Peace Force. We also have Gabriela Alves, who works as a researcher at Plataforma CIPO, a Brazilian independent institute devoted to climate, governance, and peace research. She's a political scientist and law student who's developed a strong platform for environmental justice advocacy in Brazil and Latin America through granting commentaries, interviews, and writing opinion or editorials. And finally, we have Marina Pages, who's the coordinator of CIPAS, an international nonprofit organization with a permanent presence in Mexico. CPAS works toward the deterrence and prevention of social political violence, the positive transformation of conflicts, and respect for human rights in southern Mexico. I think most of you who are joining us will know the general thrust of our conversation today, but just as a reminder, we've all come together here because we are mutually interested in the impact that the pandemic has had, not only on social cohesion and peace building, but specifically on what that means for engaging with our local counterparts, ensuring that the approaches that we are taking are sufficiently localized, but taking into consideration the impact that the pandemic has had on the way that we are able to do that work. So with that, I'm going to start by turning it over to David to give us a very brief overview of the research that CRS has been undertaking in this space before we go to GPAC to do the same. David?
Thank you very much for the introduction, and of course to the organizers for this great opportunity to share with the audience. So as most of you are aware, Catholic Relief Services has a huge and strong portfolio in peace building over the years, and still has and continue to lead in peace building efforts across the globe. And so for us, it was important since the outbreak of COVID-19 and the start of the pandemic, it was important for us to understand and to study the trends and changing dynamics around social cohesion due to, of course, the outbreak of the COVID-19, and of course, also looking at the associated response measures that several governments had put in place. And so it was important to look at that. And we did a study in 3 countries, the Philippines, Guatemala, and Ghana, gathering evidence from these countries. Now, for us to be able to study and understand the changing trends in these countries, and of course to inform policy frameworks and our own work, it was important to look at 4 thematic areas. Of course, one of that is in what ways has the COVID-19 pandemic and its associated response measures affected social cohesion dynamics. It was important to know how, one, COVID-19 itself, and of course the response measures that several governments had put in place had affected social cohesion dynamics in the communities that we work with. Of course, it was also important to know how civil society and diverse communities across the globe responded to these pandemic-related changes in social cohesion, and of course, what are the entry points or opportunity for social cohesion related work. This was quite important to us because, as I mentioned, peace building, social cohesion is a top priority for us as an agency. Also, we also wanted to know how these effects likely continue to affect fragile and conflict-affected countries. And lastly, what features need to be in place to support social cohesion, both horizontal and vertical efforts in this new COVID-19 world that we've come to admit and live with. So in terms of how we went about this study, we had a mixed method, of course, using surveys, where we use the Social Cohesion Barometer. It's a CRS tool that seeks to measure community perspective in terms of course, social cultural, in terms of the political, in terms of course, economic. And so with this tool, we are able to survey a select group of community members to get their perspective at a given time in terms of course, social cohesion and cohesiveness in their communities. And so we use that tool. Of course, we also employed key informant interviews with, of course, a core group of civil society actors, government counterparts, including local, state, and at the national level, of course, to be able to understand their perspective and reaction on things. Of course, including that, and most importantly, has to do with our, of course, engagement with community members through several focus group discussions to get their perspective on things, and of course engage them in their own community to understand and measure these changing trends and dynamics. Yes, I would just quickly, in terms of sample size, we had a little over 300 spread evenly across the 3 countries. We tried to ensure that this study was participatory. Like I mentioned, we used the social cohesion barometer, which gave the opportunity for that. We also adapted the social ecological method amongst others to ensure that we had a participatory approach to this. Now, I would quickly jump to some of the insights. Like I did indicate earlier on, this study is important to us, one, because we thought it was important to understand the changing dynamics in this new world that we've come to live with since the pandemic, to, of course, inform our policy framework, of course, and more importantly, also inform our community work and engagement with key stakeholders in the communities that we work with. And lastly, of course, to look at how to frame our social cohesion activities moving forward. I want to say this because you look at the northern part of Ghana, where CRS has a lot of its programming and project and interventions because of course it happens to be the poorest part of the country. You would see that since the pandemic, we've had close to 6 conflicts that have come up in these communities that we work with. We have the Doba Kandiga, we have the Boko issue, we have Bimbila, Kariga, and a couple of others. And so for us, it was important to understand what was going on in these communities, to understand the impact COVID-19 has had on these communities, and of course, to inform us moving forward. And so in terms of the findings and some insights we had, we did realize that 76% of respondents strongly agree that COVID-19 has negatively affected relationships and levels of social cohesion. 76 of them, 76%. Respondents also said access to COVID-19 relief was dependent on political contacts, political patronage, and of course, disbursements of funds allocated at the national level was also shrouded in corruption. Relatively, we also realized that the most damaging component of the government's COVID-19 response was its failure to be more transparent, decentralized, and consultative in the way it allocated spending and resources. And so we had a lot of community members and respondents wanting to know a breakdown of the government's COVID-19 expenditure, and of course, a timeline of when to expect some support. Of course, one thing we also did realize in terms of insights was, of course, respondents were clear that the systematic impact of COVID-19 and the long-term impact could not be addressed by only vaccinations. But however, they wanted, of course, clear policy guidelines on how to prevent conflict over scarce resources. Because what we were realizing in these communities, as I had mentioned, was that we were beginning to see a rise in tensions, a rise in communal violence and conflict. As I mentioned, we currently have 6 active ones. Before COVID-19, we had just 1. And since the dawn of COVID-19, we are seeing a rise in these conflicts in the communities as we speak. And so community members wanted to know that beyond vaccinations, they needed to have a plan around, of course, conflict prevention. There was also a lack of trust in government response to the pandemic. Of course, one, declining trust in health professionals was also another, we realized, driven, of course, by misinformation and resulting in people staying at home rather than seeking help. Of course, that compounded the trust in the general government apparatus in terms of its response. We also did realize that there was an increase in domestic violence at the family level, and then also the normalization of it at the community level since the dawn of the pandemic. And that was something that, of course, was quite alarming and of top priority to us. And lastly, there was also what we realized in terms of insights was that there was a strong collaboration between the civil society and government. This was because, of course, civil society over time has been able to develop footprint in far-flung communities, whereas the government, through, of course, establishment of networks, through their various activities, which the government could not manage to do. And so there was a reliance on civil society to play a leading role in terms of information campaign, and of course, in terms of trying to reduce tensions in these communities. And so these are some of the insights, which, of course, to us at CRS, especially in Ghana, with our portfolio, peace building portfolio. Currently, we are implementing the Sahara Peace Initiative, a multi-country intervention that seeks, of course, to attend to issues of cohesion, peace building in the Sahel region, and try to promote cohesiveness in these communities and to build stronger and stable communities. And so it was important for us with these insights to go back to the drawing board and look at entry points, opportunities that we thought, of course, COVID-19 has presented to us. And I think these insights, of course, in terms of increase in gender violence, the collaboration between civil society and government, the lack of trust in government, and all these other insights were quite helpful and would be moving forward in terms of how we frame our community engagement, in terms of stakeholder engagement, and in terms of overall social cohesion activities. So I would pause here and hand it over to Midlin for any questions. Thank you.
Thanks so much, David. I think we'll have lots of time to discuss with the participants and the other panelists in the final 30 minutes of the panel. So if you do have any questions for David and follow up on that, please drop them into the chat. We will be keeping an eye on that, and we'll come back to them in the final session, or final section of the session. With that, I'd like to turn it over to Gabriele to give us a sense of her work.
Okay. Are you listening to me? Is it okay? The audio? Okay. Hello, everyone. First, I'd like to thank the opportunity of being here today. As Melly introduced, my name is Gabriele, and I'm a researcher at Plataforma Cipó. Well, we've been working with GPAC, and recently we published an article in partnership with them entitled At the Forefront of Climate Action, Local Approaches to Climate-Sensitive Conflict and Violence Prevention, where we discussed the importance of adopting a community-based approach to achieve climate justice. My speech is around this research and others we've been elaborating. And you may wonder, what is the importance of such a topic? Because you see, vulnerable communities in conflict-affected settings often are sources of innovation and repositories of first-hand knowledge and expertise for tackling climate-related risks through locally appropriate adaptation and resilience strategies. For instance, there is another rich partnership we've made with Lab Jaca, which is a data and narrative lab on favelas based in Rio de Janeiro. And together we have developed a project called Amplifying Voices, Combating Environmental and Climate Racism in Urban Spaces, where we focused on the importance of listening to local experiences from Black communities to better design policies that truly tackle environmental and climate racism, which are reflected, for example, in the lack of access of drinking water and basic sanitation, as well as by the economic, human, and social costs of recurrent floods, and especially during this pandemic scenario. We also interviewed community leaders engaged in projects that promote environmental and climate justice in the local level. And with them, we learned how the Brazilian government is further than we imagined from giving the proper support and security to that region, especially because there is a lack of transparency and public participation, notably during the pandemic. And in Brazil, it seems that our government, even during the pandemic, only appears to criminalize our social movements and conduct violent peace operations, creating only more problems instead of promoting peace and health security. We have to change that. And well, it is important to highlight that this whole project I mentioned had a strong audiovisual component available on our Instagram account. I can leave the link in the chat below. Where we've learned not only the importance of developing new research approaches to reach a broader audience, but we've also learned the importance of mapping and harnessing community-based approaches for addressing these climate-related insecurities. I mean, favelas in general, not only in Rio de Janeiro, are constantly affected by racist policies, polity, and politics that exclude their communities from important debates and consultations. And I'm not talking about just favelas and Black communities. I'm talking about all vulnerable groups as well, like traditional communities, indigenous people and their traditional knowledge, women that commonly face higher risks and greater burdens from the impacts of climate change in situations of poverty, and are essential for achieving lasting positive peace when they are able to participate properly on the mediation processes. So it is also both undesirable and unfeasible to achieve climate justice without empowering vulnerable groups to take on climate action. Lastly, there are great opportunities for policymakers, such as developing meaningful consultation spaces with local peace builders across the strategic cycle, and have local communities represented on steering committees. In other words, engaging in the process of co-creation instead of perpetuating top-down power dynamics. Community actors are on the same foot with other partners, and we have to understand that cooperation is the only way to go. It's the only way to fully understand the deep-rooted causes of conflict and the different experiences during conflict and injustices. And in the same direction, it is also important to finance long-term climate-sensitive peace building, conflict-sensitive approaches, and sustainable initiatives led by historically excluded groups. We have seen too many projects without proper monitoring and transparency, which are both essential for the sustainable development. And to end this initial speech of mine, I'd like to highlight on a panel discussion about peace, that peace without voice is fear. So we must find ways to give proper funding, space, and technology. If distance or COVID restrictions are in the way, we should give also technology for people to demand their rights and co-create policies that allow their voices to be heard. Thank you. Feel free to ask anything.
Thank you so much, Gabriele. I think that might be the quote of the event. Peace without voice is fear. That's a really great takeaway. I'm going to turn it over to Lucy next. Lucy, are you with us? I'll just say Lucy is in a low bandwidth area, so if she can't join via the with her video on, we'll have her turn it off. But we can see you now, Lucy.
Okay, great. Well, thank you first of all so much for the invitation. And yes, that was a beautiful quote. Thank you, Gabriele. It really resonates, and the importance of funding these infrastructures and funding institutions that give voice to people from all sectors of the community is absolutely vital for peace building, because peace building is about relationship building. As Melin said at the beginning, my name is Lucy Nasebi. I live and work in East Jerusalem within Palestinian society, and my organization is also a member of GPAC. And I first heard about infrastructures for peace at a meeting of GPAC more than 10 years ago. So I'm really happy to be part of this discussion about how to strengthen and how to bring funding and recognition for these infrastructures. I think one thing that is essential is that they are giving agency. It's not just a matter of empowerment, it's also that they create agency through the cooperation and through the co-creation that Gabriele talked about. In the situation of crises and emergencies such as COVID-19, local communities often have to organize themselves to support their needs and lived realities. In the occupied Palestinian territories, for instance, during the COVID-19 pandemic, the communities demonstrated very strong resilience throughout the occupied territories, pulling together resources and sharing them with each other. There were no funds initially from the government, no support from the government. They simply didn't have it. And those of us in East Jerusalem, which is annexed rather than occupied, and therefore under Israeli control rather than control of the Palestinian Authority, we were even more worried that we would actually be excluded from whatever measures were being taken. And it meant that not only did people get together to help each other out with basic necessities, but for instance, one person, a wealthy Palestinian, donated a whole hotel to be used as a quarantine hotel. Other people donated, and we put up tents outside the hospitals as testing centers. And there was enormous support, mutual support, as there had been also during uprisings. This is also a time when communities have got together, and these count as infrastructures for peace, as we local peace builders understand them. Unfortunately, these were not sustainable. They continue in a minor way, but as soon as the Palestinian Authority, for instance, became responsible or was seen as being responsible for taking over the tasks of these committees, it meant that actually they fell apart. And without financial support to specifically continue with such infrastructures, it's impossible to maintain them. With my organization, MEND, we have done a number of projects involving establishing infrastructures for peace. For instance, with a women's group where we worked with the police and the media and the local government. And it lasted for 2 years. It lasted a year beyond the project, but nothing can be supported unless there is continuous support. Ad hoc structures tend to evaporate. And what's worse is that they get taken over by local traditional structures, such as village councils, which tend to be male-dominated. And because they're there, they are seen as something that is sufficient, whereas the infrastructures along the lines of those that were formed during the COVID pandemic are much more widely represented, gender, profession, as cross-sections of society. And of course, the challenge in the availability of resources for peace building, including finances, qualified personnel, and equipment for peace building, is well recognized. However, the models of financing for peace building that exist and function don't always allow for impactful action at the field level. The funding available through traditional channels is generally project-based and short-term. Again, Gabriele, I think, alluded to long-term. And there was a meeting earlier today about feminist financing. Everyone emphasized the importance of long-term funding. Long-term funding can support infrastructures for peace. This is how you build the relationships and create the bodies that are necessary to continue to build community cohesion. One of the problems in Palestine has been the breaking of social cohesion. It's a situation not only of physical violence or the threat of physical violence, but also of structural violence. And this has meant really fragmenting the society. What the reaction to COVID did was prove the possibility of people coming together again within communities, across political lines, across religious lines. And this was a very positive lesson. And this is why I mentioned earlier the importance of agency, because once people acquire agency, they acquire hope, which is also an essential ingredient for peace building. Living under occupation, it tends to deny people a sense of agency or any sense of hope. It, if anything, destroys that. So by coming together and working with community building, this has multiple benefits in addition to the immediate outcomes. When I was asking about different experiences in relation to this presentation, I was speaking with a partner in Gaza, and he was thrilled at the prospect that there could be funding for something like this. He's someone who said he had been involved as a member of the elite in attempts to reconcile between the two major Palestinian factions, which is something that currently is one of the factors that makes peace here impossible. And he said, if only there could be infrastructures like this, groups of people working, communities that would then come together and prove that they can overcome the political differences, that this would be a way to overcome. He said, I would be the first person to join one of these or to work with a project like this. If you can get funding, he said, I'm with you. So it's not something just in an ideal world. It's something that could be put to good use immediately in a terrible place like Gaza. So we know the limitations. We've seen the weakness of systems and structures that are securitized and that don't take into account the welfare of individuals and that ignore long-standing economic and social inequalities. All of this has become emphasized during the pandemic. But we can also learn something positive. We can learn that there is an opportunity that we can seize to inspire a transformative change in peace building towards an inclusive, human security-based approach that is adequately financed and meaningfully supported through global policy. This includes strengthening the focus on human security in peace building work and ensuring that demilitarization lies at the core of peace building action. Demilitarization because security at the community level, when the community is responsible, then that is where the security counts in terms of health, economics, human dignity, fear, and also ensuring that donors take into consideration the fact that innovative means and long-term means are necessary to ensure that money reaches people at the community level. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Lucy. That was really wonderful, and I'm very glad that we could have you here, given the bandwidth stretch that I know you're facing at the moment.
Bandwidth is from snow and cold, not from anything else.
It looks cold over there. I'm looking at your scarf. I'm going to take this opportunity now to bring us into a dialogue together, and I think that should be very interesting, in part because we're all working in very different areas and on very different things, but there are so many different overlapping and intersecting areas of interest. So I'd like to start with a sort of two-part question. The first part being that in the current context, what do you think is the right level to target? The individual, the family, civil society, local governments, etc., in peace-building interventions? And the second part of this question is, do our current programming approaches and funding mechanisms, importantly, adequately allow for that? Anyone can jump in. Sorry, I should have said that. Please jump in if you have a comment. If you would like to comment, if you just raise a hand, I can see you, and then I'll call your name. Marina, please, followed by Gabriele.
Hi, everybody. I'm working with an NGO in Mexico, and we've been working here since 1995. So we have a long-term perspective on peace building. down here. And I think that in general, we will say that multi-track and multi-level actor strategies are the best for a long-term peace building. But it's true that the COVID brings a sense of emergency that leads to other kind of priorities. In the case of Mexico, well, it was mentioned in the presentations before, this distance between state actors and non-state actors and the lack of trust regarding the government and its answers to the pandemic and what it has brought, because it's not only the health situation that is a source of preoccupation at this point. And something that has been really interesting in southern Mexico, which is the main indigenous and rural regions of Mexico, is that the indigenous communities and rural villages had to rely once again on their own resources to attend the situation. There was a lack of answers from part of the government, and it's kind of an opportunity, which is a paradox. But this situation of difficulty have brought once again, or they discovered once again, their agency, their ability to have more strategic answers, more collective ones. And I think it's really interesting to see that part and to try and build once again this strategies of peace building centered on this grassroots level, and not so much in trying to reach out political actors and decision makers that in the end have no clue what could be done in the actual context. So to go back to build once again a situation from bottom up and not just the contrary. So it's interesting in that sense to listen from Brazil. I think that we are actually in the same kind of situation, because there is no, the government has been denying the existence of COVID or the fact that it's a huge problem, especially in the case of Mexico or regarding education, because they closed all the schools for 1.5 years, which is barbaric in the end, not only for education, but also for mental health for children and youth persons. So I think, yes, we are at a key moment, and for CPAS, it's more like to target those actors, because in the long term, they are who are going to be able to make the difference. So now, regarding the second part of your question, the current programming approaches, I was mentioning that the search of answers from part of the authorities are being even more out of sync than in the past, which is something to say, And misinformation has been omnipresent, and it's difficult for us to compensate, the lack of mass media presence on what is happening. And we also have to face a trend of criminalization of human rights defenders and a huge situation of violence regarding journalism. So that there is like a black hole, Where can you reach true information? What is true? And coming to we thought were a problem anymore. And there is also another aspect, because the other persons were mentioning, which is totally true, the lack of funds with the perspective of long-term changes that need to be made, social changes. But there is also the COVID brought a crisis of multilateralism, structures such as the UNO or the OAS in Latin America have been, without ability to make a difference here. So once again, we are coming back to, the lack of or traditional answers to situation of crisis aren't working anymore. So we need to go back to where the strength is and has always been, but we, from time to time, forget it.
Thank you. Over to you, Gabriele.
Yes, I'd like to answer a bit of the first part of the question, and I make Marina's words my own. I think she gave the most complete answer possible. I think the scenario here in Brazil is really close to what you have described, and you asked what would be the right level to approach. As I said before, I think the cooperation is the best way, but we need to enhance and support subsidize community approaches because they will subsidize policymaking decisions, which is not happening right now here in Brazil because during the pandemic we are facing like a complete shutdown of public participation spaces, and they may argue that, oh, it's because of COVID, we don't want anybody to have COVID or health issues, but they are promoting parties and events. So it's only like an excuse to shut down those spaces and silence our voices. So I think it would be the best approach is actually to improve all levels. As Marina said, I believe that the top-down decision-making process is not working anymore. And we have to boost community leaders and especially the youth so they can be a part of the process. They can co-create things and use technology, which is a new space, and we have never lived anything like that before in history. So I think we need to reimagine. We have to make an imaginative exercise to think in a new way to do politics and in a new way to cooperate, especially because I was talking about climate justice, and the climate is a global issue. So we have to tackle that with extreme cooperation. Otherwise, we are all going to sink, and it's the same boat. Thank you.
Thank you for that. Yes, over to you, Lucy.
Yes, thank you. I mean, obviously, I agree with both Marina and Gabriele that, we really need to, it's important to target all levels. I don't believe that there is a single right level, and I believe there is strength in diversity, I think is one of the important things. But it's really important to find ways that work to link people together. And what Gabriele just said about technology, I wanted to mention briefly a methodology that my organization MEND has been working with called Participatory Video, where a small group are trained in filmmaking through interactive games, and they learn to become more articulate and more self-confident. So they choose what they make the film about. And then they show this film not only within their community to elicit feedback, but they take it, eventually they should reach policymakers or reach people that they want to influence. So this is one way, using technology to raise authentic voices. This will be women from a refugee camp here, or youth, again, maybe from a refugee camp or in some difficult situation, but whose voices normally have no way to reach policymakers or be heard. And film, I think, short films, 1.5 minutes, 2 minutes, can be a way to overcome many of the barriers that marginalized groups face, because people are more willing to, I'm afraid, listen to a video often than to listen or allow people into their space. So it's important to work vertically as well as horizontally.
That actually leads very neatly into my next question, which is, does the pandemic, in your experience thus far, create opportunities to convince government stakeholders to pursue more human security approaches as a means of strengthening vertical social cohesion? And I guess there's an implied question there, which is, should we be encouraging them to see it through that lens? Are there any potential negative implications of that approach? I can perhaps just lead in quickly before going to Gabriela and Marina by saying that with the research we've been doing with CRS, one of the things that we found, for instance, in Guatemala, and I believe also in the Ghana context, and David can speak to this better than I can, is that the perception, as David mentioned, that the pandemic aid, government pandemic aid, has been distributed in a very clientelistic way, has created problems for some of the civil society responders. This was true in Guatemala, certainly, who decided to engage with the government to deliver that aid. They were then seen in some cases as being complicit in some of the backroom deals that communities felt were being struck in terms of how that aid was being parceled out. And so, though we saw in the Philippines that it was really important to the success of those aid interventions from the government, that CSOs be engaged in order to get community buy-in, particularly from communities, maybe indigenous communities, for instance, who had been historically marginalized by those same governments. The risk on the other side of that was that the CSOs and the organizations that engaged were then actually suffered a loss of trust from the communities that they were working in and hoping to support. Just a food for thought sort of comments from our research. Gabriele?
Okay. I think that was a great question, because I believe that in theory, it creates amazing opportunities. With the pandemic, we are dealing with health insecurity all the time. But it catches my attention that even though we are living through a global crisis with countless dimensions in it, there are countries that still insist on armed and militarized solutions. I'm talking about Brazil as well, with its militarized interventions in favelas and so on. So we must have like twice as much attention to peaceful solutions and peace building. And as I said before, human security emphasize that securing people in the face of complex threats can only happen through multilateral cooperation and national partnerships that bring academia, civil society, and the private sector. But there is another point I'd like to highlight, that here in Brazil, we are facing an increase of environmental crimes. And we know that they are deeply connected with organized crime. So this scenario for environmental and climate activists are super dangerous. And a couple of weeks ago, an entire family at the state of Pará that acted on conservation projects was murdered, and the reason is still unknown. When we talk about human security, we must not forget the importance of protecting environmental defenders, because they should partner up with the government to achieve a sustainable common goal. That is the goal of it, not the other way around, as we have been seeing with our current political scenario, especially with the current leadership we have here in Brazil, which is as bad as you think it is.
Thank you for that. Let's go to Marina and then to Lucy.
There is an opportunity in every crisis. We're working from the perspective of conflict transformation in CPAS. So yeah, every crisis is an opportunity. But I think there is a huge difference between the changes in public opinion and stakeholders. Regarding public opinion, I think that there is a clear concept that the idea is not to building back the old normal. Structural changes needs to be made, especially regarding health and all the social package to answer crisis such as the one that we have at present. But when I try to think of stakeholders in Mexico, I think the situation is actually worse, because they don't have any counterweight. Due to the COVID, there is no possibility to use the justice system, which doesn't work, generally speaking. But at present, they have the perfect pretext to say, well, we can't open because, we need to respect the distances and whatever. And there has been not only a huge militarization of society, but also legalization of militarization in Mexico in the last period of time. And they actually don't work only in public security, which is actually already something that they shouldn't be doing, but in development projects, for instance, building the Mayan train or dams or this kind of thing. It's not supposed to be their role, and they are doing it at present. And they also had this participation regarding vaccination campaigns. So it's an opportunity also to normalize that presence of militarization in every aspect of life. And yes, there is this difficulty to try and reach balance between what people are thinking and what the stakeholders are doing. But this is a perfect pretext for them not to do things, justifying that this is a context that impede them to do changes.
Very important points. Lucy. I think you're on mute, Lucy.
Sorry, I thought I'd taking that a little bit further. This difference between the public opinion and the need for structural change. I have heard human security used far more in the past 2 years than I had ever heard it before, which is to me a good sign that people are more and more becoming aware that there is such a thing as human security, a people-centered approach, even at the same time as there is this enormous increase in militarization. But it doesn't mean that the militarization has to be seen as being effective. I think it can be seen as being ineffective in dealing with COVID. I mean, it really still isn't coping with it or helping people to cope. 1 or 2 countries have brought in the army to help with vaccinations and things, but nothing to do with national or military security. It actually undermined the whole process at the beginning. The national emphasis has limited the donations, the spread of vaccinations to areas in the world that desperately need it. And there were cases of planes being hijacked for masks and things at the beginning, which it's easy to forget about. But the other thing is about protection, and protection can be done with unarmed civilians. There is unarmed civilian protection based on a human security approach, and this is increasing. The Nonviolent Peace Force works in many conflict zones and is now it's part of a whole, if you like, movement that is really becoming more and more appreciated as a way to protect people and make people more secure. For instance, even Nonviolent Peace Force is working now in the United States. It works in Myanmar and Iraq and South Sudan, but for the last year and a half now has programs in the United States working on training people in unarmed civilian protection. So I've heard of a movement in France working with the police there. And the other day, someone was talking about it in Barcelona in the Catalonian context. So I think there is also a human security approach that is growing. You know, maybe sometimes you get one thing and you get its opposite coming up with it too. So it's a matter of trying to support the human people-centered approach.
Yeah,
Thank you.
just to add to what my colleagues have said, I think, of course, it presents a lot of opportunity as well as, of course, challenges. I think what we've seen from our side has been that in terms of opportunities, we've seen a lot of young men and women, youth leaders step up in the communities that we work to do a lot of activism and to lead a lot of engagement and step, into that role. And I think that is something that we have been really quite impressed with. Especially, you see a lot of women group at the height of lockdown and restrictions in Ghana and in the sub-region. We did see that governments and even community leaders were deferring, for example, issues around opening markets or commercial centers. They were deferring them to women groups, to take that decision. And that alone already is showing a shift. And of course, that is a good opportunity. bearing in mind that for a country like Ghana, and of course in the sub-region, the role of women in peace building or in day-to-day community life has always been restricted, and they are always far away from decision making. I think that was one clear opportunity. And also for us in the work that we do to see female youth leaders being empowered to lead, information campaigns, engagement with, government, right, in the face and in visible, areas of community life was quite impressive. And also, just to add, in terms of course, what when you look at you mentioned the issue, the case of civil society organizations and the challenges it poses to them. I would say yes, and that of course brings to my comment around in terms of levels of engagement, where they become a key role, because of course government did defer to them, did sought their assistance. However, of course, from the data we saw, we realized that community members' perception of them and their actions sort of put them in bad light. And so that was something that we also did realize, from the data and interaction with community members. I wanted to emphasize. Over.
Thank you, David. For the sake of time, I'm going to ask one final question before we turn it over to the participants, to our audience, so they have some time with all of you. The final question I have is, do our current understandings of peace building adequately take the environment into account as an actor in and an output of social cohesion? And I will just contextualize that question a little bit by saying something from the Guatemala data that we saw, which was that the Maya Chorti communities tended to emphasize the environment not only as a shared good, or an external force that had an impact on social cohesion, but also as an actor in their social community, an agentive actor in their social community. And that made me realize that we tend to consider social cohesion from a very anthropocentric sort of worldview. But that's not necessarily the way that all people in the world understand the world that they live in and the social networks that they occupy. So with that, questions about how we can account for the environment in different, maybe new ways that reflect broader views of the world. Marina?
Well, I live very close to the border with Guatemala, so I think that we are sharing the same context here. Actually, for the Mayan population here in southern Mexico, the idea of peace is translated by a concept called Liquilcush, which is like good living or living, and it includes, once again, yes, environment as an actor. It's the idea of harmony between people, but also between people and hers, or Mother Earth, and I will say. But it's true that this is their appreciation of how environment should be included in peace concepts. We face, I think, the same reality just all around the world, linked to the situation or the system, the capitalist system of land and territory and natural resources as a key element for capital. But for indigenous population and in rural regions in general, the relationship with environment is just something totally different, and we need to learn from them.
Thank you for that, Marina. I'll definitely be following up with you to get that phrase so that we can reference it in our final report. Any of our other panelists like to come in and comment? Gabriele?
Okay, going back to your question, I don't think they take that much into consideration, because I think the risk analysis and diagnosis that have been done so far of conflicts, violence, and disputes, they don't often take in consideration the disputes for natural resources and the impacts of deforestation, the effects of climate change that tend to amplify even more the tensions between the people. So it is important to incorporate these local level perceptions. And like, for example, in the Amazon rainforest, it's no use having like a violence prevention program without taking in consideration and having better responses to these forest fires and destructions of the environment as well. What we see in Brazil and in sub-Saharan Africa is that policies and answers to security issues are commonly divorced from environmental initiatives. And the challenge is to integrate the knowledge of these aspects and therefore design better answers. At CIPO, we are working with UNDP and GPAC, in addition to partners in Zimbabwe and Uganda, to identify the best practices in the incorporation of environmental factors into peace building process. And as Marina mentioned, there is a regional leader, an indigenous leader here in Brazil called Davi Yanomami. He wrote a book called The Sky Fall. I think that's the best translation for it. And I read it last year and I've learned a lot, especially the cosmovision that the indigenous people have between the environment and their selves. And I think we, as the white man and the capitalist man, we are very distant from that. And when we try to, I don't know, build better approaches to tackle the problems that these people live, we don't take in consideration their points of view and their culture and their spirituality. And I think these are all important aspects that we should also address when talking about human dignity. So I think that's it.
Thank you, Gabriela. I think that's a really important addition. Lucy, please.
Yeah, I don't want to say much because the environment, it's part of the entire problem in this region anyway. Water is scarce. Other resources are abundant, like gas and natural gas and things, but they are all part of the problem. And so I think I'll leave it at that.
Thank you for that. David, did you come off of mute? I see.
Yes, just to add a little comment. I think in the case of the sub-region, sub-Sahara region, and in Ghana, what we are seeing in communities, especially border communities, is that we are seeing a shift, of course, from chieftaincy disputes to more, resource-based, natural resources and the environment. And so that is something that has, it's of concern to us. And of course, I like the fact that Gabriela mentioned and talked about, of course, policies and framework around addressing these root causes, because that is something we are seeing. A lot of mining, going on, deforestation and things like that, and serving as catalysts and pressure points for conflicts and tensions in these communities. So that is something that has sort of taken a new phase of the conflict situation in Ghana and in the Sahel region. Yeah.
Well, I think with that, a very rich vein of discussion, I will open the floor to our audience here. I'll start with a question that came through. I believe it was for Lucy, speaking on MEPA. I think the exact question was wondering if you could share your thoughts on MEPA. And that came from Lena Kumar. So Lucy, if you need any additional information, please do ask Lena for clarification.
Sure. I need to tidy it up, and I'll be happy to send it. Thank you for asking. I also saw another question for me that I was trying to write in the chat, but I wanted to be listening to the conversation. So anyway, thank you, Lena.
Please do, if you have any questions for any of the panelists, if you drop those into the chat. Again, I know this is a new platform for all of us. So if you haven't been looking at the room chat, there's been a bit of back and forth there, and it's a place where you can pose questions and I can then see them and share them with the presenters. So please do drop things in. While our audience is typing their questions up, I might take facilitator privileges to ask David to speak a little bit about one of the findings of our research so far has been that almost universally in all 3 locations, respondents to our survey said that they believed that the level of their society which had been most positively affected by the pandemic in terms of social cohesion was within the family unit, which is interesting because it was not something that was necessarily in the scope of what we were looking for. But I know, David, you also made some very good points about the impact of the pandemic in terms of gender relations and especially gender-based violence. And I think that's something that we've seen globally as an impact of the pandemic. And with women being such key stakeholders, obviously, in peace-building initiatives, and particularly in a lot of these community systems and networks, I'm wondering what your thoughts are in terms of how those 2 things that seem to be a bit paradoxical, improvements in social cohesion within the family unit, within the household, rising levels of gender-based violence. How would you, and I'm sorry to put you on the spot a little bit, but I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on that.
Happy to. Yeah, I think when you look at the data, that was something like you mentioned, that was noted. Now, when you look at the situation of Ghana, when we had strict, restrictions at the peak of the pandemic, what happened was that we didn't have a lot of communal interactions. Of course, people were not going for naming ceremonies. Funerals were limited to just, a core group of family members. And so people didn't have that external interaction that they so much crave for. And now, if you know West Africa very well, the community and the people is so much built around extended family, and it's a close-knit community. And so whilst that happened, due to, of course, social distancing, strict COVID-19 policies and restrictions, people were able to get that support from within the family unit. And so that was, a good thing, that people within the family were able to, get closer. They were able to share these moments with each other. However, we also did realize that from the data, you would see that there was an increase in gender-based violence at the family level. And this was because of course, the economic pressures, that COVID-19, had brought onto these families. And then, of course, also looking at the issues around, of course, the, 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 the society in Ghana as we speak. One thing we did realize, and I think that we've known, and that the data pointed to, of course, is the normalization of these acts of violence at the community level. And so the pandemic sort of re-echoed and reinforced and made this normal at the community level, and therefore it slowly transcended, into the family life, and made it, I wouldn't say easier, but of course created a fertile ground for that increase in numbers that we saw. And I think, of course, unfortunately, due to the lack of that communal interaction, serve as the basis, unfortunately, and the catalyst for that increase that we saw in the numbers. And of course, unfortunately, it's still an issue. Over.
Would any of our panelists like to respond to David in terms of sharing experiences that you've had in the places where you're working? I've got a question here from Marina. At David, it would be good to learn from you about infrastructures for peace in your community. We at GPAC did work before with the Ghana Peace Council. Has it ever been operationalized? Is there an early warning and early response system that's operational? How have these supported during the pandemic?
Yes, thank you for the question. Yes, so one thing I would like to mention is that, of course, what we've come to realize with our Sahel Peace Initiative, and what we've tend to rely on, has been these community structures. They've been quite helpful, and that is something I think we tend to try to do, not to reinvent the wheel, the wheel, but to work around these already existing and empowering these structures. And I like the fact that you mentioned the National Peace Council. Now, I can say that that has been operationalized. It served as a strong pillar of social cohesion and a pillar for peace building for Ghana. And what we've done with the support of CRS has been that we've gone a step further to establish, peace councils at the regional and state level. And so each region now has a regional peace council, and not just at the national level. And what we've seen with these national peace councils and the regional ones is that the diversity of the membership. We have people from different religious backgrounds. We have, of course, minority groups in there, and then, of course, we try to, of course, encourage women participation, and that having a true reflection of communities and regions that these peace councils represent has been the key, for success for these, peace council, because people see them and see a reflection of themselves. They see a reflection of the community, and of course, they see their views being presented and represented. And so we've seen a huge success with their work, and of course, that has served as the blueprint for empowering other community structures that we've come across. Over.
Thanks, David. That was really, really enlightening. We have a question in the chat here from Alexandra Conroy. Thank you all for these great points. I was wondering if you could speak to what you think the greatest challenge of localizing peace-building initiatives are, such as short-term funding that doesn't prioritize sustainability or a lack of supporting local capacity, etc. A big and very important question. Thank you for that, Alexandra. Panelists? Lucy, go ahead.
Yeah, well, first, just before that, I would like to thank David. I think Ghana is one of the countries that's really an example for the rest of us. So thank you very much for really being the very enlightening talk. Thank you. I think, the challenges are very much at the level of the funding. If it could be long-term, if it could be done, at the moment, funding tends to be done towards, for instance, consortia of like-minded NGOs. You don't get the kind of diversity and cross-sectional and mixture even of individuals and groups that you need for the kind of community structures that you were talking about. And I think it's perhaps hard to find a way that could work for donors, but if that could be figured out, then it would be possible to build these. And they would, of course, it would have to be long-term. If you do something for a year or 2 years, you barely get people together, and then it falls apart. And you set up an office, you set up all that it needs, but you can't sustain it. And so it's, I think it's essentially the funding. I don't think it's lack of interest or desire among people. I think most people I know here, at least, would really welcome such an initiative.
If I may just jump in on that point and then over to Marina. One thing that we've seen in the Myanmar response, and as a compounding difficulty in addressing some of the issues that have emerged in Myanmar post-coup, has been that the sustainability push in Myanmar over the last 5 years had really focused on trying to build legitimacy in the civilian government, and local CSOs and local activist networks, particularly ethnic, non-majority, let's say, communities around the borderlands and other parts of the country, had really tried to push back against this pressure they were facing from INGOs and other donors, trying to get them to do things like register legally under the civilian government. And that was coming from a desire to create sustainability by eventually trying to turn some of these programs and services over to the civilian government. Of course, the hesitancy that those local actors had stemmed from distrust about the transition and whether or not that was going to be a lasting one, and also distrust in Aung San Suu Kyi's government, the NLD. And sure enough, what's happened now, and in the post-coup context, is that every one of those local organizations and activist networks that did register as part of their obligations to receive donor money have now had their names on a list that the military junta has been able to basically go down and issue arrest warrants for every single one of those different participants in those networks. So a very challenging situation created by the way that donors and international organizations approached the sustainability of their programs. Lucy, I saw your hand go up.
Yes, I'm sorry. I just wanted to add the importance of trust between donors and beneficiaries, and what was mentioned at the beginning, I think by Gabriele, about co-creation. If you can build partnerships, if you can strategize together, organize between donors, maybe INGOs, locals, and really build together what you want to do, how you want to measure it, then it matters less whether you're registered, whether you come up with some kind of abstract indicators. You can work together to decide upon the results. So if you build satisfactory, active partnerships around strategy, that way enables it to become long-term and to have this mutual trust and respect that is the fundamental need for any successful funding.
Marina, please.
Okay, regarding funding, I guess that Brazil will have the same problem. Mexico is supposed to be one of the richest country at present, or at least part of the 15 first countries. And there's been, there is a disconnection between peace building funding. The priority has been development. And since Mexico, which is a huge country such as Brazil, there are parts where you have poverty just same as in Africa, but we have difficulties because the priority is linked to that level of development. Lots of foundations have left Mexico, and in Latin America, they just maintain in general 2 or 3 countries, no more. So I think part of the difficulty is also like to prioritize what is urgent and not necessarily what is important. So focus on direct violence and not on peace building. And it's really a different kind of strategy. This is why when we are talking also about long-term, is the social changes and cultural ones that need to be made won't be made in a 3 years planning. So it's I think another difficulties, and there are emergencies just everywhere at present, including in Occidental countries. So especially for Europe, the priorities now is more Africa and Eastern Europe. Latin America is just, so there is also this vinculation between security, not human security, their own security and their priorities. So there is no conflict sensitive reading of what is happening, and yes, not a perspective on peace building, except if there is an armed conflict in the middle of it. So for instance, in Latin America, Colombia, and maybe Guatemala, if you've been working since the 90s in Latin America. But the rest of the continent, it looks like we don't exist. And at present, Mexico is even worse than what was Colombia regarding drug trafficking and its role on organized crime. So violence is omnipresent for the population here, but there is, once again, not a perspective on peace building and peace building bottom up, but more on how do we impose security at a regional level. So not only financing, but also perspective on what kind of solutions regarding conflicts and violence.
We have another question here from Johanna, who says, to all, could you elaborate on why you need global support as a local peace builder, and what role does the UN play? Has the UN been a useful supporter of your local peace building action? Any panelists like to come in on that one? I know certainly in the Myanmar context, where I'm working most closely, the general perception is that the UN has not been especially helpful in the way that it has framed a number of issues. On the other hand, in terms of the programming they're doing, some of the programs that they're doing are incredibly impactful, and especially in addressing some of the worst elements of the pandemic. So I think what we see in the Myanmar context is that the seeming disconnect between the public-facing aspect of the UN and the programs aspect of the UN actually undermines the work that they are doing, which is helpful. Marina, I think I saw your hand go up.
I think for people that know of Guatemala or Colombia, there are different moments in different persons. The UN, at least in Mexico, is here like embassies through the invitation of the Mexican government, and they need to answer to that invitation. They are not free to travel wherever they want to go or to say whatever they want to say. So the previous ombudsman of the UN in Mexico was key and said pretty tough stuff, but at present, they are not here. We don't know a thing about them. They haven't traveled to the regions. So yeah, there is a political dimension on the UN that will make a strong difference regarding the role that they may play in a reality or another one. At present, in Mexico at least, the UN doesn't play any kind of role. We have had 3 journalists that have been killed since the beginning of the year. If they have said something, I haven't heard about it. And this is something that is pretty easy to say. Nobody is going to say, yeah, go on killing journalists. Not even on those aspects are talking at present. So we are worried, and we feel like they are not there. But they are here at invitation of the Mexican government, and they can say whatever they want to say.
Gabriele, and then to Lucy.
Yeah, I'd like to add a little bit about what Marina said, mostly about the last question, is because I think what we see here in Brazil with the denialist government is that it's harder to have trust of funders, of funding in general. And we lost like the Amazon Fund, which was really important to tackle deforestation and forest fires. But I mean, thinking about all this scenario, it comes to my mind what happened at the last COP in Glasgow, where the Brazilian government manipulated the data about the Paris Agreement, lying about our contributions to the agreement. So the government has no shame on manipulating the data anymore here in Brazil and denying the pandemic and many other issues that we are facing right now. They have already denied that our levels of deforestation are way higher. Our president has publicly stated that the deforestation is not a problem in Brazil, even though it is the highest score ever in our history. So I think that if I would put another aspect to what Lucy said about the problem being the financial support, I would say that the political one is really important as well, at least as what we are like living here in Brazil right now. Because it's not only the president, it's the entire structure of the government, it's the parliament, and it's the laws that they are approving that cause damages to the forest and indigenous people and traditional communities. So I think that when we talk about peace building, we have to talk about the laws that are currently being elaborated and how the president has the power to influence the decisions that are currently being discussed in the parliament. And again, I think that's what I wanted to add up.
Thank you, Gabriele. Before we go to Lucy, just for a final answer, I think we're in our last 2 minutes, so I think Lucy's comment will be the final one. So what I'd like to just ask the panelists is to please in the chat, so that the audience and we can all stay in touch and continue to engage and keep asking these questions and having these important discussions. Please do include your email address or your Twitter handle where you best like to engage, so that the audience can reach you if they have follow-up questions. Over to you, Lucy. I think we might have gotten Lucy right in the final moment of a pause, actually. If she's able to come back, we'll turn to her. Marina, did I see you had your hand up as well to come in on that comment? Okay, great. Then I think we'll have 1 minute left, so why don't we close there? As I said, please do share your contact details, and for those in the audience, we really appreciate you being here with us. And please do reach out to the speakers so that everyone can stay in touch and continue to engage. Thank you for spending the last hour and a half with us, and a big thanks to the panelists and everyone who was here today, and to the organizers for bringing us all together. Thank you again.